He pretended to be asleep to test the shy girl who served in his house. A quiet, cruel little game, born of boredom and a grief so vast it had hollowed him out completely. But the game changed the very first night. What he witnessed her do in the dead of night, believing him to be lost to the world, didn't just surprise him. It struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a silent act of such profound, unexpected compassion that it made the powerful rancher freeze in his chair, a prisoner of his own deceit. His breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. In that moment, Jedediah Thorne knew this was no longer a game. It was a reckoning. The Stony Creek Ranch was Jedediah's kingdom, a sprawling territory of jagged peaks, whispering pines and rolling grasslands that stretched as far as the eye could see. He had built it with his own two hands, transforming a rugged piece of the Colorado frontier into an empire of cattle and timber. Every fence post, every brand on a calf, every nail in the great manor house was a testament to his strength and his will. But now it was a kingdom without a queen, without an heir. It had been 3 years since the fever. A merciless thief in the night had stolen his wife Sarah and their 5-year-old son, Thomas. Since then, the magnificent house, which once rang with laughter and the frantic footsteps of a child, had fallen into an oppressive, suffocating silence. The air itself felt thick with memories, and every shadow seemed to hold the shape of someone who was no longer there. Jedediah, a man who could command 100 riders and face down a blizzard, was powerless against these ghosts. So he waged a war against them with exhaustion, working his body to the brink of collapse, so his mind would be too numb to remember. His men saw a hard master, a ghost of a man who rode harder and worked longer than anyone, his face a mask of cold granite. They didn't see the man who, in the solitude of his office, would sometimes trace the rim of a dusty toy soldier left on a shelf, his callous fingers trembling. Into this mausoleum of a home walked Elizabeth Lell. She arrived on a dusty stagecoach from Missouri, a slip of a girl at 22, with eyes the color of a stormy sky that rarely lifted from the floor. She was hired as a junior housemaid, just another cog in the machine that kept the massive ranch house running. To the head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, she was unremarkable, perhaps too timid for the harsh realities of life in the West. Elizabeth moved through the grand rooms with the quiet efficiency of a moth, her footsteps so light they were often unheard. She cleaned grates, polished silver that was never used, and changed linens in rooms that were always empty, her presence a mere whisper against the backdrop of Jedediah's roaring silence. For weeks he paid her no mind. She was a shadow, and his house was already full of them. He barely knew her name. The change came on a Tuesday night, one thick with the coming chill of autumn. A deep restlessness had settled in Jedediah's bones, a familiar ache that work had not managed to dull. Prowling the darkened halls of his own home, he was drawn by a sliver of light from the kitchen. He stopped, hidden by the deep shadows of the doorway, and listened. She was finishing her final chores, and she was talking, her voice a soft, low whisper meant only for herself. He heard her cataloging her fears, the simple terror of being so far from home, of making a mistake that would see her cast out. He heard her express a raw, humble gratitude for the warmth of the kitchen, for the steady pay that was more than she had ever known. Then her whispers shifted, and the air in Jedediah's lungs turned to ice. She was talking about him. She whispered of the sadness in his shoulders, a weight so heavy she felt it across the room. She spoke of his eyes, how they didn't seem to see the world in front of him, but rather stared through it at a past only he could perceive. "It's like his heart is frozen," she murmured to the soapy water, "and he's forgotten what the sun feels like." The words were not an insult, nor were they born of pity. They were a simple, shattering truth. This girl, this inconsequential shadow, had looked past the powerful rancher, past the cold master of Stony Creek, and had seen the broken man shivering inside. A tempest of emotions churned within him. Anger at the intrusion, shame at being so transparent, and beneath it all, a strange and terrifying flicker of connection. He needed to know more. He needed to understand the source of such quiet perception. It was then that the deceitful plan took root in his mind. A desperate, flawed idea to pull back the curtain on this mysterious woman. He would pretend to be asleep in his office each night, an open book of feigned vulnerability, to see what she would do, to test the depths of the compassion he had just glimpsed. He retreated to his office that night, not just as a man haunted by the past, but as a hunter, stalking the truth of the one person who had truly seen him. He settled into the chair, slowed his breathing, and waited for the sound of her soft footsteps, utterly unaware that the test he had designed for her was in fact a trial for his own frozen heart. The ritual began the following night as the great-grandfather clock in the hall chimed 10. Jedediah sat at the heavy oak desk in his office, the flickering lamplight casting long dancing shadows across the room. Before him lay an open ledger, the neat columns of figures, a testament to his worldly success. But tonight, they were meaningless ink on paper. His gaze was fixed on the fireplace, where a portrait of his wife and son hung above the mantel. Their painted smiles were a constant, silent accusation of the joy that had been extinguished from this house. The room was his sanctuary and his prison, filled with the scent of old leather, wood smoke, and a loneliness so palpable it was almost a taste in the back of his throat. With a slow, deliberate breath, he pushed himself away from the desk and settled into the large leather armchair facing the fire. This was his stage. He let his head fall to one side, slackened his jaw, and forced his breathing into a deep, rhythmic cadence. He draped one arm over the side of the chair, his fingers brushing the cool floorboards. A perfect portrait of a man utterly consumed by exhaustion. Every nerve in his body, however, was screamingly awake, coiled with an attention he hadn't felt in years. He was a hunter in a blind, waiting for the most delicate and mysterious of prey. He heard her long before he saw her, the faintest whisper of soft-soled shoes on the wooden floor of the hallway. The door creaked open, a sound so soft he would have missed it had he not been listening with every fiber of his being. He felt a subtle shift in the air as she entered the room, bringing with her a faint, clean scent of lavender soap and cold night air. The deception was agony. The urge to open his eyes, to confirm it was her, was a physical torment he had to wrestle into submission. He heard the delicate clink of a glass and spoon being placed on the tray she had come to collect. He imagined her movements, her quiet efficiency, the way she seemed to glide rather than walk. He expected her to gather the items and depart. A brief and silent intrusion? He was wrong. The footsteps paused, not by the desk, but beside his chair. He could feel her presence, a warmth just inches away. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Then he felt it. A gentle weight, impossibly soft, settled over his shoulders and chest. A thick woolen blanket. She was covering him. The gesture was so simple, so profoundly unexpected, it sent a jolt through his entire body. He fought to keep his breathing even, to prevent the tremor that threatened to betray him. No one had shown him such a casual, unthinking act of care in 3 years. His men respected him, feared him even. His housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, served him with brisk efficiency. But this was different. This was pure, unadorned kindness, offered to a man she believed was oblivious, unable to thank her or even acknowledge it. It was a gift given in secret, and therefore, it was utterly real. He felt her move away, a soft rustle of fabric, and thought the moment had passed. But she did not go to the door. Her footsteps stopped again, this time on the hearth rug. He risked the barest flutter of his eyelids, a sliver of vision through his lashes. He could see her silhouette against the dying orange glow of the embers. She was standing before the portrait of his family. Her head was tilted, her hands clasped before her. For a long moment she was completely still, a silent observer of his lost happiness. Then the whisper came, so quiet it was barely more than a breath on the air. "He misses you so," she murmured, not to herself, but to the smiling faces in the painting. "I see you in his eyes. Don't you worry. A heart as strong as his can learn to beat again." She lingered for another second, a silent communion with the ghosts of his house, before turning and gliding out of the room, closing the door with that same ghostly quiet. Jedediah did not move. He could not. The blanket on his shoulders felt as heavy as a mountain, pinning him to the chair. Her words echoed in the profound silence of the room, replaying over and over in his mind. She hadn't just seen his pain. She had spoken to it. She had ministered to it. He had set out to test the character of a simple maid, to satisfy a dark curiosity. Instead, he felt as though he had been stripped bare, his own soul laid out and inspected by this timid whisper of a girl. The shame of his deceit was a bitter fire in his gut, but beneath it, a new and terrifying sensation was taking root. It was a fragile warmth, a thawing in the deep, frozen core of his being. The game was over. He had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. This was no longer about satisfying curiosity. It was now a desperate, vital need. He had to know the heart of the woman who spoke to ghosts and covered broken men with blankets. The fire in the hearth had nearly died, leaving the room in a profound and familiar cold. But for the first time in 3 long years, Jedediah Thorne felt a flicker of warmth that had nothing to do with flames. It was a terrifying, fragile heat, and he knew with a certainty that shook him to his very soul that he would willingly walk through hell itself to feel it again. The nights that followed fell into a strange, sacred pattern, a silent ritual that became the new center of Jedediah's universe. His days on the ranch remained a blur of dust, sweat, and the barking of dogs, a harsh reality he endured with grim determination. But as darkness fell, a different kind of reality would begin, one that existed solely within the four walls of his office. The charade of sleep had become second nature to him. He would settle into the great leather chair, and the world would fall away, his senses narrowing to a single point of focus, the sound of her approaching footsteps. He became an expert in the subtle language of her presence. He learned the soft swish of her wool skirt, the near inaudible sigh she would let out as she surveyed the room, the gentle, rhythmic way she would stoke the dying embers in the hearth. Each night, she would drape the heavy wool blanket over his shoulders, her movements precise and careful so as not to disturb his feigned slumber. He would feel the warmth seep into his bones, a nightly shield against the cold that had lived inside him for so long. This clandestine observance was a new kind of torture. Jedediah, a man of direct action, was now a passive spectator in his own life, a king reduced to hiding in his own throne room. His mind, accustomed to solving problems of cattle and coin, was now mired in a swamp of unanswerable questions. Who was this woman? Why this relentless, anonymous compassion? A part of him, the cynical, wounded part that had been his only companion for 3 years, searched for a motive. Was it a ploy for favor? A clever manipulation? But the theory crumbled every time she entered the room. Her kindness was too quiet, too consistent, too utterly devoid of an audience. There was no one to impress, no one to reward her. She performed these acts of grace in what she believed was total solitude, for a man who would never know. This realization shamed him, yet it also drew him deeper into his obsession. He was no longer just watching her, he was studying her. He started to notice the details that painted a fuller picture of Elizabeth Lell. He saw the slight wear on the collar of her simple dress, the way her knuckles were red and chapped from the harsh lye soap and the endless work. He noticed a persistent, almost imperceptible weariness in her posture, the subtle droop of her shoulders that she would quickly straighten, as if catching herself in a moment of weakness. She was not some ethereal angel of mercy. She was a young woman, tired and likely lonely, who still found the strength to care for the sorrows of another. Then came the seventh night of his vigil, the night everything changed again. She entered as usual, the soft click of the door latch announcing her arrival. She collected the tray from his desk and draped the blanket over his shoulders. He felt her linger for a moment, and he sensed a subtle shift in the air, a hint of hesitation. She moved to the hearth and added a log to the fire, the flames leaping up to cast her silhouette against the far wall. But instead of leaving, her soft footsteps approached him again, stopping this time not beside his chair, but in front of his desk. He heard a soft metallic scrape, the sound of a small tin being placed on the polished wood. Then she was beside him, her presence closer than it had ever been. He could feel the warmth radiating from her, could smell the clean, earthy scent of the outdoors on her clothes. Her whisper, when it came, was a current of warm air against his temple. "Sir," she murmured to the sleeping man, her voice barely audible. I... I hope you don't mind. I saw your hands from the cold and the rains. They look painful." She paused, and he could hear the nervousness in her breath. "It's just an ointment. My mother, she used to make it from comfrey root and herbs from her garden. It helps with the cracks. It helps things mend." With that, she drew back. Her work was done. A moment later, he heard her footsteps retreating, the soft click of the door, and then silence. A profound, ringing silence that was now filled with the scent of herbs and the weight of an impossible intimacy. Jedediah sat bolt upright, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The feigned sleep was shattered, forgotten. His gaze fell upon the small, unassuming tin on his desk. It was more than an ointment. It was a confession, a story, a bridge. In offering him a piece of her mother's wisdom, she had offered him the first real piece of herself. This was not a general, sweeping compassion for a grieving man. It was a specific, observant act of healing directed at a physical wound she had taken the time to notice. He reached out a trembling hand and opened the tin. The scent was clean and medicinal, the smell of the earth, of things that grow and heal. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and scarred from years of labor, now marked by the deep bleeding cracks of the coming winter. He understood then that her nightly kindness was not a gift without a price. It was a silent invitation, a challenge issued from her world of quiet feeling into his of desolate emptiness. And the cost of accepting it, he realized with a profound and terrifying clarity, was that he would have to become a man worthy of being mended. The small tin of ointment became a thing of profound significance to Jedediah. That night, after Elizabeth had departed, he sat at his desk for a long while, simply looking at it. Then slowly, as if performing a sacred rite, he rubbed the cool, fragrant balm into the cracked, bleeding fissures of his hands. The relief was immediate, a gentle soothing of the physical pain. But it was more than that. With this simple act, he was consciously accepting her care, allowing a sliver of someone else's warmth to penetrate his self-imposed winter. It was a surrender, and in that surrender, he felt the first stirrings of a forgotten strength. This small, secret acceptance began to ripple outwards, subtly altering the cold, rigid world he had built around himself. The next morning, as his foreman, a grizzled man named Silas, gave his daily report on the north pasture fence, Jedediah did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He looked the man in the eye and asked, "And your wife, Silas? Is her cough any better?" Silas was so stunned, he stammered for a full 10 seconds before managing a reply. Later that day, Jedediah ordered a dozen of the finest wool blankets from the Mercantile in Telluride to be distributed among the bunkhouse hands. It was an act of unprecedented, and to his men, baffling generosity. These were the first tremors of a deep and seismic shift, the first signs that the frozen ground of Jedediah's heart was beginning to thaw. His nightly vigils continued, but his purpose had changed. He was no longer just a passive recipient of her quiet kindness. He was now an active protector. His authority as the master of the ranch, a power he had long taken for granted and used only to build his fortune, now seemed to have a new and a startling purpose. It became his tool for a covert mission, to shield Elizabeth from the harshness of her world. Through his nightly observations, he saw the full extent of her burdens. He saw the exhaustion in the slight tremble of her hands as she lifted a heavy tray. He overheard the sharp, critical tone the head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, used with her, assigning her the most grueling tasks: hauling water from the icy pump in the pre-dawn chill, scrubbing the vast stone floors of the great hall on her hands and knees. His power, he realized, was the key to easing these burdens without ever revealing the source of his knowledge. It was a delicate, dangerous game, a trial of his own ingenuity. He began to move his pieces across the board with the subtle strategy of a chess master. He couldn't single her out. That would invite ruinous gossip. So he acted with broad, sweeping gestures that had her at their center. He issued a new household directive, delivered through a bemused Mrs. Gable, stating that due to the early cold, no single staff member was to be responsible for all the exterior chores. The work was to be rotated daily among everyone, junior and senior staff alike. He saw that her thin shawl was no match for the biting wind, so he purchased a bolt of thick, warm wool, ordering Mrs. Gable to distribute it to all the housemaids for the mending of their winter clothes, knowing full well that Elizabeth's need was the most dire. One evening, feigning carelessness, he left a pair of his old fleece-lined leather riding gloves, still in excellent condition, on a side table in the hall. He watched from the shadows of his office doorway as she found them while dusting. He saw the conflict on her face, her innate honesty warring with her obvious need. He watched her pick them up, intending to take them to the lost and found. But then she hesitated, running her chapped fingers over the soft leather. In the end, she left them on the table. But the next morning, Jedediah instructed Mrs. Gable to announce that any unclaimed items would be given to the staff. That evening, he felt a quiet, fierce surge of victory when he saw Elizabeth wearing the gloves as she returned from an errand, her hands finally protected from the cold. These small, secret victories were starting to rebuild him, piece by piece. But his actions, however subtle, were not going unnoticed. Mrs. Gable, a woman for whom the rigid structure of the household was a religion, saw these changes not as generosity, but as anomalies, disruptions to the natural order. She observed the master's newfound and peculiar interest in the daily welfare of the junior staff. She noted the expensive, out-of-season purchases, and her sharp, bird-like eyes did not miss the fact that the quiet, timid maid from Missouri now wore a pair of gloves that were unmistakably the master's. Suspicion began to curdle in her mind, a poisonous brew of propriety and jealousy. The breaking point came on a cold afternoon in the great hall. Jedediah stood by the fire, reviewing a shipping manifest. Elizabeth was on the far side of the room, quietly polishing a silver candelabra, a picture of diligent obscurity. Mrs. Gable entered, her back ramrod straight, and marched directly to Jedediah, stopping a few feet from him. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice crisp and loud enough to carry across the cavernous room. "A word, if I may, regarding the household accounts." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air, ensuring she had Elizabeth's attention as well. "Your recent expenditures on staff comforts are unusual. It is causing a certain amount of discussion. There is a concern that your focus has become unbalanced, that you are showing a particular and distracting level of concern for the well-being of the most junior members of your staff." Every word was a carefully chosen dart, aimed not just at him, but at the terrified young woman across the room who had frozen in place, her face pale with shock and dawning horror. Jedediah was trapped, his secret war of kindness suddenly dragged into the light, forcing a choice he was not ready to make. Defend his actions and risk exposing everything, or retreat into his fortress of silence and abandon his protectorate. The air in the great hall was thick with a sudden, suffocating tension. Mrs. Gable's words hung between them, a poisoned dart aimed with perfect precision. Elizabeth stood frozen across the room, her face ashen, the silver candelabra in her hand forgotten. In that moment, she was no longer an invisible maid, but the unwilling center of a scandal, exposed and shamed by the sharp-tongued housekeeper. Jedediah felt a cold, hard rage coalesce in his chest. For 3 years, he had been a ghost in his own home, a passive observer of a life that had lost all meaning. But Mrs. Gable's public cruelty, her attempt to use his own nascent kindness as a weapon against this vulnerable young woman, had awakened something primal and fierce within him. He drew a breath to speak, to unleash a command that would put the housekeeper in her place so forcefully she would never dare challenge him again. But he never got the chance. The true crisis of that day had not yet begun. That night, Jedediah waited in his office, but the familiar anticipation of the ritual was gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The encounter in the hall had unsettled him deeply. He worried that Elizabeth, mortified and frightened, would break her routine, that she would no longer dare to enter his office. The thought of the room remaining empty, of the blanket not being placed on his shoulders, left him with a sense of dread that was entirely new and deeply unnerving. When the clock chimed the hour and he finally heard her soft footsteps in the hall, he did not feel relief, but a tightening in his gut. Something was wrong. The footsteps were not their usual light, gliding motion. They were heavy, unsteady, almost a shuffle. The door opened and she entered, framed for a moment in the dim light of the hallway. Her face, usually pale, was flushed with a high, feverish color, and her eyes, though still downcast, seemed unfocused, glassy. It was clear she was ill, but she was there, driven by a sense of duty so powerful it had forced her from her sickbed, likely terrified that any lapse in her work after Mrs. Gable's accusation would cost her the only home she had. She moved toward the desk, one hand braced against a bookshelf to steady herself. She reached for the tray with a trembling hand, her movements slow and uncertain. As her fingers brushed against the cool glass, her body swayed violently, her eyes rolling back in her head. It was the turning point. In that split second, 3 years of grief-stricken apathy were incinerated in a blaze of pure, unthinking instinct. The deception, the nightly game, the careful analysis, all of it was gone, blasted away by a terrifying protective urgency. He was not a master observing a servant. He was a man watching the only flicker of light in his world about to be extinguished. With a guttural cry, he exploded from the chair. The heavy oak piece scraped violently against the floorboards as he launched himself across the room. He reached her just as her knees gave way, catching her in his arms, pulling her slight frame against his chest. The heat radiating from her was like a furnace, a dry, dangerous fire. It was the first time they had ever touched, and in that moment of contact, the world shifted on its axis. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on his face, so close to her own. Confusion warred with the fever in her gaze, followed by a wave of dawning horror and a shame so profound it seemed to cause her more pain than the illness. You, you were awake, she whispered, the words a ragged, broken sound. Her humiliation was the last thing on his mind. Looking down at her, at the fragility of her life held in his arms, Jedediah was struck by a revelation more powerful than any of her quiet kindnesses. The truth. He was not just concerned, he was terrified. The thought of losing her, of this fragile light being snuffed out, was a physical agony, a pain that dwarfed the dull ache of the ghosts he had lived with for so long. Without a word, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing and carried her to the large armchair by the fire, settling her gently into its depths. Then he turned, and his voice, when it came, was not the measured tone of the rancher, but a roar of pure command that shook the very timbers of the house. "Mrs. Gable!" The housekeeper appeared in the doorway moments later, her face a mask of shocked indignation, which dissolved into stunned disbelief at the sight before her. The master of the house, kneeling on the floor beside his own chair, cradling the sick and semi-conscious form of the junior maid. Before she could form a single scandalized word, Jedediah's command cut through the air like a whip. "Get Silas. Tell him to ride for Dr. Miller. He is not to spare the horse, and he is not to return without him. Do you understand?" For the first time since she had been hired, Mrs. Gable was rendered utterly speechless. The rigid hierarchy of the house, the ironclad rules of propriety she so viciously enforced, had been shattered into a million pieces. She saw the look on Jedediah's face, a fearsome, protective fury she had never imagined, and simply nodded, her authority completely broken, before turning and rushing to obey. The house erupted into a controlled chaos of urgent footsteps and hushed, frantic whispers. But in the office, a new profound silence had fallen. Jedediah held a damp cloth to Elizabeth's forehead, and in the quiet space between his command and the coming storm, he knew that the old world was gone forever. He had not just saved a servant from a fall, he had publicly declared her value, and in doing so, had set his own heart on a course from which there could be no retreat. The long night bled into a tense, gray dawn, with the entire Stony Creek Ranch holding its breath. The frantic gallop of Silas's horse had faded into the darkness hours ago, leaving behind a profound and unnerving quiet. Inside the manor, this quiet was concentrated in a guest bedroom on the main floor, a room that had not been used in 3 years. Jedediah had carried Elizabeth there himself, laying her gently on a bed with clean, soft linens, an act of such scandalous domesticity that it sent silent shockwaves through the staff. He refused to leave her side. He sat in a chair by the bed, a basin of cool water at his feet, and for hours his only task was to bathe her fevered brow with a soft cloth. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway for a time, her face a thunderous portrait of disapproval, but she said nothing. The master's command had been absolute, and the look in his eyes had been a warning more potent than any words. He was no longer the distant, grieving ghost she had served for 3 years. He was a guardian, fierce and unyielding, and the rigid world she governed had been turned completely on its head. In the flickering lamplight, with only the sound of Elizabeth's shallow breathing for company, Jedediah felt the last of his icy detachment melt away, replaced by the simple, terrifying vulnerability of a man afraid to lose something precious. Dr. Miller, a man with a pragmatic soul and eyes that missed nothing, finally arrived, his face etched with weariness from his hard ride. He examined Elizabeth thoroughly, his movements efficient and calm. He diagnosed a severe inflammation of the lungs, dangerous but treatable with rest, steam, and the medicines he provided. As he packed his bag to leave, he looked at Jedediah, who hadn't moved from his post by the bed. The doctor didn't comment on the impropriety of the situation. Instead, he simply said, "She's strong, Jedediah, but she'll need careful nursing. The next few days are critical." In his gaze, Jedediah saw not judgment, but a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement of the powerful, unspoken truth in the room. This was not about a master and a servant. It was about a man desperately holding on to his one reason to hope. After the doctor departed, Jedediah cemented the new order of his household. He informed Mrs. Gable that Elizabeth was to be treated as a guest of the house and that he, personally, would oversee her recovery. The days that followed were a strange, timeless period of quiet healing. The raging fever gave way to a gentle, restorative sleep. The house operated in hushed tones around the sick room, which had become the new heart of the manor. Jedediah took his meals on a tray by her bedside. He managed the ranch's vast business from the chair where he had once feigned sleep, his ledgers and reports spread across a small table. When Elizabeth was finally lucid, a tentative, fragile peace settled between them. The topic of his deception, of those nights of secret observation, was a silent entity in the room, too raw and complex to be touched. Instead, they built a new connection from scratch with the hesitant language of strangers. He asked her about the farm she grew up on in Missouri, and he listened, truly listened, as she spoke of green hills and wide rivers, a world away from the stark majesty of Colorado. She, in a voice still weak but clear, asked him about the horses she saw in the pastures, and a flicker of his old passion returned as he described their bloodlines and temperaments. In the quiet intimacy of that room, the rigid titles of master and maid dissolved, leaving only two people, Jedediah and Elizabeth, learning the shape of each other's souls. The moment that truly bound them came one afternoon in the drowsy space between waking and sleeping. As a soft rain pattered against the window pane, Elizabeth began to hum a simple, hauntingly familiar melody. Jedediah froze, the report in his hand forgotten. The tune was an old lullaby, a soft, sorrowful song that felt like a ghost on the air. It was the same lullaby his wife, Sarah, used to sing to their son Thomas every single night as he drifted off to sleep. The sound of it from Elizabeth's lips was so unexpected it felt like a miracle and a wound all at once. His voice was thick with emotion when he asked her, "Where did you learn that song?" She opened her eyes, a faint smile on her lips. "My mother sang it to me," she whispered. "It was her mother's song before that. It's the only one our family ever kept." The revelation settled over Jedediah with a profound weight. It was not a coincidence. It was a sign, a thread of music, of motherly love stretching across generations and miles, weaving their disparate pasts together. It was as if the spirits of his lost family were giving their silent, melodic blessing. A week later, the peace felt real, almost permanent. Elizabeth was finally strong enough to walk, and Jedediah escorted her into the crisp autumn air of the manor's walled garden. The sun was warm on their faces, and for the first time, they stood together not as patient and caretaker, but as a man and a woman on something resembling equal ground. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but comfortable. Just as he was about to tell her that her life as a servant was over, that he would find a place for her as a companion, a partner, the outside world came crashing in. His foreman Silas entered the garden, his hat clutched in his hands, his face a mask of grim reluctance. He stopped before them, his eyes darting nervously between Jedediah and Elizabeth. "Sir," he began, his voice low, "I have to tell you, my ride to town for the doctor and his visits since, it's all anyone in Telluride is talking about." Jedediah's posture stiffened. "They're saying things, sir, ugly things, about a wealthy widower and his young, pretty maid, about you keeping her in the main house." Silas took a deep breath, unable to meet his boss's eye. "It ain't just whispers now, sir. The talk is venomous. They're calling her your mistress." The words fell like stones into the quiet peace of the garden, shattering it completely. The private world of healing and connection they had built was now under siege, and the ugly, brutal judgment of the society beyond their gates had finally arrived. Silas's words hung in the crisp garden air, a poison that withered the fragile peace they had just begun to nurture. Jedediah saw the effect on Elizabeth immediately. The delicate color that had returned to her cheeks drained away, leaving her pale and stricken. The light in her eyes, a light he was just beginning to recognize as hope, was extinguished, replaced by a familiar, hunted look of fear. A glacial fury, cold and absolute, settled over Jedediah. For 3 years he had allowed the world to shrink to the size of his own grief. Now that world had dared to attack the one person who had made him want to live in it again. He placed a hand gently on Elizabeth's arm, a silent anchor in the sudden storm. "Their words are wind, Elizabeth," he said, his voice low but laced with steel. "They mean nothing." But he saw in her eyes that she didn't believe him. To her, the whispers of the world were a hurricane, and she was standing in its destructive path. In that moment, he knew that hiding from the threat was not an option. He would have to ride out and meet the storm head-on. His plan was audacious, a direct and public defiance of the very social conventions that sought to condemn them. The upcoming Sunday was the annual Community Harvest Ball, the single most important social event in Telluride. For the past 3 years, Jedediah's absence from such gatherings had been a given, his empty chair a testament to his reclusive sorrow. But this year he would attend, and he would not go alone. He presented the idea to Elizabeth not as a request, but as a statement of fact. He had a seamstress brought from town along with bolts of the finest blue silk, instructing the bewildered woman to craft a gown fit for a queen. Elizabeth protested, her voice trembling, insisting that she would only bring him shame, that she was just a maid. Jedediah cut her off, his tone gentle but firm. "You are a guest in my home," he declared, "and you will be my partner at the ball." He was drawing a line in the sand, not just for the town, but for her, forcing her to see herself through his eyes. Not as a servant, but as his equal. The night of the ball arrived, charged with an electric tension. As they prepared to leave, Jedediah saw his reflection in the hall mirror. He was a different man from the ghost who had haunted these halls. He was dressed in a fine black suit, his posture straight, his eyes clear and determined. He had something to protect. When Elizabeth descended the staircase, the entire house seemed to fall silent. The simple blue gown transformed her. She was no longer a timid housemaid, but a woman of breathtaking grace and quiet dignity. For a moment, all Jedediah could do was stare, his heart aching with a feeling so intense it was almost painful. He offered her his arm, and as her small hand rested on his sleeve, he felt a bond solidify between them, a silent promise to face what was coming together. Their entrance into the town hall sent a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. The lively music faltered for a beat. All conversation stopped. 100 pairs of eyes turned to them, a mixture of disbelief, scorn, and hungry curiosity. Jedediah could feel the venomous whispers start up again, a sibilant hiss from all corners of the room. He ignored them completely. He led Elizabeth to the center of the dance floor, just as the orchestra began a waltz. He placed one hand on her waist, took her other in his, and began to dance. He moved with a confidence he hadn't felt in years, his gaze locked on hers, creating a world that consisted of only the two of them. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw a flicker of wonder, of a joy so pure it outshone the malice surrounding them. For that one dance, they were not a scandal. They were simply a man and a woman, perfectly in step, a silent, graceful rebuttal to the ugliness of the crowd. He thought this act of defiance would be their victory. He believed that by showing the town he was unashamed, he could silence them. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the threat. The town's gossip was merely the catalyst. The true danger was not the hatred in their eyes, but the love and sense of honor inside Elizabeth's own heart. While he saw the dance as a declaration of their strength, she saw every hostile glare, every wife who turned her back, every sneering comment she wasn't meant to hear. She saw that his shield was costing him his place in the world, and she made a silent, heartbreaking decision. To save the man she was coming to love, she would have to destroy their bond completely. Later that night, an unsettling quiet fell over the ranch. Jedediah, feeling a sense of weary triumph, bid Elizabeth good night at her door, his mind replaying the moment of joy on her face during their dance. He believed they had weathered the storm, but hours later, a strange premonition, a cold dread, crept over him. He found himself walking back to her room, needing to reassure himself. He knocked softly. Silence. He knocked again, louder this time, a knot of panic tightening in his chest. When no answer came, he pushed the door open. The room was cold, the window slightly ajar to the frigid night air. And it was empty. The beautiful blue gown was draped carefully over a chair, and on the perfectly made bed, a small folded note rested on the pillow. His hands trembled as he opened it. The words were few, written in a neat but tear-blotted script. They spoke of her immense gratitude and her deepest regret for bringing shame to his name, ending with a simple, devastating line. The only way to repay your kindness is to disappear from your life. He raced to the window and stared out into the vast, moon-drenched landscape. There, a mile down the long, lonely road, was a single small figure, walking resolutely into the immense and dangerous darkness of the west. The threat had not been the town. The true threat was her selfless heart, and his victory had just cost him everything. The moment he read the last word of her note, a primal fear, colder and sharper than any grief he had ever known, seized Jedediah Thorne. He did not hesitate. He did not stop for a coat or a saddle. He burst from the manor and ran to the nearest corral, his mind a maelstrom of terror. He threw a blanket on the back of his fastest stallion, bridled it with frantic, fumbling hands, and launched himself onto its back. He spurred the horse into a desperate, reckless gallop, tearing through the night with a single, all-consuming purpose: to outrun the silence she had left behind. The moonlit landscape flashed by in a blur of silver and shadow. The wind tore at his clothes, a mournful howl that seemed to mock his pursuit. Every thunderous beat of the horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth was a countdown. Every yard gained, a prayer against the vast, unforgiving darkness that had swallowed her whole. He was no longer the master of Stony Creek. He was just a man, stripped of everything but the terrifying possibility of a world without her in it. He found her nearly 2 miles down the road, a small, solitary figure, walking with a heartbreaking resolve. He reined his horse in so sharply it reared, its breath misting in the frigid air. He swung down from its back and stood before her, blocking her path. The final battlefield was not a grand hall or a pasture, but this lonely stretch of dirt road under a canopy of a million indifferent stars. She looked at him, her face pale in the moonlight, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. There was no fear in her gaze, only a deep, tragic sadness. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice breaking, "let me go. It is the only way, for your own good." This, then, was the final assault. Her own self-sacrificing love, turned into a weapon to sever them forever. But the man standing before her was not the same man she had met weeks ago. The walls around his heart had not just been cracked, they had been demolished. He took a step closer, and when he spoke, his voice was raw, stripped of all artifice and authority. "For my own good?" he asked, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping his lips. "Elizabeth, there has been no good in my life for 3 years. There was only silence and work and ghosts." He took another step, closing the space between them. I have not been honest with you. The night I found you ill, I was not asleep. I have not been asleep any of the nights you have come to my office." Her eyes widened in shock, but he did not let her speak. The confession poured out of him, a torrent of truth held back for too long. He told her everything, of hearing her whispers in the kitchen, of his cruel, lonely plan to test her, and of how that test had shattered him. "I sat in that chair night after night, a fraud in my own home," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I watched you. I saw you cover a man you thought was sleeping with a blanket. I saw you speak to the memory of my family. I saw you leave medicine for my hands. I set out to observe a maid, and instead I witnessed a miracle. You fought the darkness in my house, and you had no idea you were fighting the darkness in me too." He reached out his hands, gently taking her by the shoulders. "You see, you cannot leave to save my reputation, because I no longer care for it. You cannot leave to save me from the town's whispers, because their noise is nothing compared to the deafening silence you would leave behind. The only thing in this world that can truly ruin me is you walking away down this road." He looked directly into her eyes, letting her see the raw, desperate truth of his soul. "I do not see a maid, Elizabeth. When I look at you, I see the other half of my own heart. I see my equal, my partner. I see my future." The cold logic of her sacrifice crumbled under the weight of his absolute, unconditional declaration. Her resolve broke, and a sob escaped her lips. And there on that dusty road, with the wilderness as his witness, he made his final, decisive move. He went down on one knee before her, the master of 1,000 acres kneeling in the dirt. "Don't leave me, Elizabeth Lell," he pleaded. "Stay and build a new life with me. Be my wife." The proposal was a cataclysm, an act so far beyond the realm of possibility that it reordered her universe. It was not a plea, but a promise. It was not a request, but a revolution against the world that had tried to tear them apart. Through her tears, she could only nod, a gesture of stunned, overwhelming, and absolute acceptance. The confrontation was over. Victory had been achieved not with anger or authority, but with the devastating power of a vulnerable heart laid bare. He rose and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks before lifting her onto his horse and mounting behind her, enclosing her in his arms. The lights of the Stony Creek Ranch were a beacon in the distance, a promise of a home they would now build together. The whispers of Telluride would surely roar into a gale when the news arrived. But as they rode through the quiet darkness, his arms securely around her, neither of them cared. For the first time, they were truly ready to face the storm. The wedding was not held in the grand church in Telluride, with its prying eyes and poisoned whispers. To do so would have been to grant the town's judgment a power it no longer had over them. Instead, they chose a place of quiet sanctity, a small grove of shimmering aspen trees on a hill that overlooked the entire Stony Creek Valley. It was the same hill where Jedediah's first wife and son were laid to rest under two simple hand-carved stones. He and Elizabeth stood before a traveling minister with only the pragmatic Dr. Miller and a loyal, teary-eyed Silas as their witnesses. By choosing this spot, Jedediah was not replacing his past, but rather making peace with it. It was a silent, solemn request for the blessing of the ghosts who had haunted him, an integration of his profound grief with his newfound, fragile hope. As they spoke their vows, the wind rustled through the aspen leaves, a sound like gentle applause. And in that moment, their union was sealed not just by the laws of man, but by the quiet, enduring spirit of the land itself. Elizabeth Lell, the timid maid from Missouri, became Elizabeth Thorne, the lady of Stony Creek Ranch, not by social climbing, but by an act of pure revolutionary love. A year passed. The seasons turned, painting the mountains in the brilliant gold of autumn, burying them in the deep, silent white of winter, and reawakening them with the vibrant, tenacious green of spring. The Stony Creek Ranch was transformed. The manor house, once a cold and echoing mausoleum of memory, now felt like a home. Fresh wildflowers, picked by Elizabeth from the surrounding meadows, stood in vases on the mantelpiece, their bright colors a stark contrast to the dark, polished wood. The scent of baking bread and roasting herbs often drifted from the kitchen, and the oppressive silence had been replaced by the soft murmur of a house at peace. Jedediah Thorne was a changed man. The haunted, driven look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm, steady light. The deep lines of sorrow on his face had been softened by the new habit of smiling. He was no longer a ghost in his own life. He was present, engaged, a partner to the woman who had resurrected his heart. And Elizabeth, she blossomed. As the mistress of the manor, she ruled not with commands, but with the same quiet compassion that had always been her nature. The staff, including a profoundly humbled Mrs. Gable, afforded her a deep and genuine respect, born not of her new station, but of the unwavering integrity of her character. The town of Telluride had at first been apoplectic with scandalized gossip. The news of the marriage was a firestorm. The Thorns were snubbed at the mercantile, and invitations to social events ceased to arrive. But Jedediah and Elizabeth refused to engage in the battle. They did not retaliate, nor did they retreat. They simply lived. They built a life of quiet dignity, focused on their land and their people. They opened a small school in a converted barn for the children of the ranch hands, with Elizabeth herself teaching the younger ones how to read. They hosted a midsummer festival, not for the town's elite, but for their own workers and their families. A celebration of the harvest filled with music, food, and genuine laughter. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the narrative began to change. The town's venomous gossip began to sound shrill and petty in the face of the Thorns' quiet grace. People began to see not a scandal, but a love story, a tale of a broken man brought back to life by a woman of profound and unassuming strength. Their union, once a source of scorn, was becoming the stuff of local legend, a testament to the fact that a life built on genuine love was impervious to the bitter winds of judgment. One warm evening, as the sun bled into a palette of fiery orange and soft purple behind the distant peaks, Jedediah and Elizabeth sat together on the wide veranda of the house. A comfortable silence settled between them, the silence of two people who no longer needed words to understand one another. The day's work was done, the house was quiet, and the world felt right. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. Her skin was no longer chapped and raw, but soft and cared for. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of reverence. He looked at her, the woman who had entered his life as a whisper and had become his entire world. He thought back to the lonely man he had been, feigning sleep in a dark room, and he knew he had been the one who was truly asleep, blind to the possibility of a life like this. He leaned in close, his voice a low, contented murmur against her ear. "Tomorrow is a new day," he whispered. This time it was not a promise of a future battle to be fought, but a simple, peaceful acknowledgement of the beautiful, shared life that stretched out before them. The narrator would say that in the vast and unforgiving landscape of the Old West, men fought for land, for gold, for honor. But the greatest fortunes were not measured in acres or ounces. They were measured in the quiet moments like these. The story of Jedediah and Elizabeth Thorne became a quiet truth whispered on the Colorado wind, that the deepest wounds can be healed, that family is not always a matter of blood but of choice, and that a true home is not a structure of wood and stone, but the safe and sacred space one finds in another's heart. Did you enjoy this journey? Let us know what corner of the world you're watching this story from. Leave a comment. And to make sure you don't miss the next adventure, subscribe to the channel.